This is the Performance People podcast, brought to you by our new brand, Ainsley & Ainsley, giving you the sleep, rest and recovery you need when you need it most with our new night powder supplement. Shake and take 1 to 2 hours before bed, sleep like an athlete and wake up different. Now on the pod this week, Steve Magness, who's a coach and author who's worked with everyone from Olympians, CEOs and NBA stars to develop the mental and physical skills to elevate their game. As an elite runner who had his own brush with burnout, we focus our chat on why rest and recovery is so crucial to high performers in any field and yet is so often overlooked. We cover the role of sleep and performance, what good recovery looks like for high achievers, what burnout actually is, as well as the most effective ways to prevent it, and why our definition of mental toughness could be part of the problem. Make sure you listen or watch on your usual platforms and enjoy.
Are we just signing ourselves up for just way too much here? Are we just trying to be too good at everything and take on everything and be, that person that can have it all of the time?
The best performers, overwhelmingly across business to sport, have more intrinsic motivation. There's some sort of joy, curiosity, exploration of let's see what my potential is. So the best thing that you can do is do difficult things or challenging things so that you can give yourself the evidence that, hey, I've shown up for this.
Can we just talk about the power of sleep as a recovery mechanism?
Yeah, I think it's the best recovery tool there is. And the science backs that up. If you're listening to this and you're a CEO or a high performer and you're like, I can't, that'll take my edge off. That's mostly insecurity. I'm not asking you to not care about winning. Just try a little bit.
So Steve, when I was doing some research to figure out who I was going to be speaking to on today's pod, this is the description I found of you. One of the giants of modern thinking about high performance. So no pressure or anything, no pressure, but just putting it out there. I want to know everything there is to know about high performance. I'm slightly setting myself up here. We have a product company which prides itself on offering people better daily performance by virtue of our supplements, night powder and day powder, which hasn't come out yet, but is coming out soon. And now you've got me terrified because I got to start thinking about this all over again and in a slightly different way. Can we start with the moment that sort of got it all going for you? The moment where you sort of, you realized that we could look at performance differently?
Absolutely. I think it goes all the way back to my competitive days. I was a runner in athletics. And at my peak, when I was 18, I ran a mile in 4 minutes and 1 second. So just shy of that mythical barrier that, Roger Bannister
That's
broke.
heartbreaking. That's heartbreakingly close. It's just so painfully close. But that would have been a seriously competitive time, right? I mean, where did that sort of stand in the stature of?
Yeah, so at the time I was 18, so I was the number 1 junior, so under 20 miler in the United States. So I was very good, and on the way to you accomplish that, and you think, okay, I'm on the way. The next step is the senior level and then the Olympics and all that stuff. But the long story short is I never got better. I never ran a step faster, so I never broke that barrier. And I think, that's a little painful. I think it was the impetus for understanding performance more holistically, because the way I got to that time was I was like, oh, how do I improve? I just train more and always train because I was young, I could essentially beat my head against the wall and kind of come back. But eventually that comes back to bite you. So that whole year, for example, I never took a day off. And guess what the result was? Injury, burnout, just never getting to that next level. And I think, young athlete Steve might have been disappointed. I don't think I would have gone down this journey to understand, okay, hey, hold on a second. Let's step back. How do people actually get the most out of themselves? So in a strange way, my biggest failure is what propelled my career.
Isn't that often the way, though? That's often the way. I can't say the same thing for me running. I ran the 1500, which is effectively the mile, in 6:30 something, and consider that to be a decent size achievement. But obviously, nothing like what you've managed to achieve. I think it's interesting, isn't it, when you look at performance, though, from a different perspective. And certainly, like, the word failure is something that we're not supposed to be comfortable with. And even, I look at my daughter at school, and you want them to cock stuff up, because if they don't get stuff wrong, how are they ever going to learn to get stuff right? But there is this stigma attached to getting things wrong. And, on a written page, you want to scrub stuff out that you've got wrong and write it correctly again, so that the teacher sees that you've written it nicely and marks you well for it. So there's definitely something in our society or in our makeup that doesn't reward or encourage failure, isn't there?
There is, and I think that's a huge disadvantage to us, because if you look at the research on the psychology of failure, if you start to view failure as something that hits your soul, like attacks your ego, then you're less likely to learn and grow from it. You start seeing it as not that, like, I failed at this race or I lost this race, but your brain interprets it as I am a failure because I did not do good enough. And when we go that direction, it essentially shuts us down. We have this what psychologists call a psychological immune system that is essentially to kind of protect our sense of self, to make us feel like it's okay, like everything's going to be all right. And that's helpful. But if we engage that too much, like, we don't grow from the thing. So I think you're 100% right. And in fact, there's some wonderful research on elite footballers that compared those who like made it to the top, to the Premier Leagues, and then those who were equally talented as juniors, but didn't quite make it. And one of the key characteristics was that those who made it to the top had some sort of struggle during their junior career where they
There's
had
always
to.
a story. There's always a story, isn't there? My mum always says it about a Grand National winner. The Grand National is like our greatest horse race in this country. And she always says, bet your money on the horse that has the story behind it, that is the least likely to probably, in many people's consciousness, come through this because of XYZ. And it's true. There's always a story that has to be an overcoming of a thing.
Absolutely. And again, there's research on that. There's when we have a story where we overcome things, we build resilience. When we don't, like, we don't internalize that. We just think like, oh, I'm pretty good at this, until inevitably reality is going to smack us in the face at some point. And if you have that resilience, that overcoming story, you're going to be able to handle it. If you
And
don't,
are we becoming less resilient as a group of people because we're sort of not able to deal with or we're resisting dealing with situations that we don't want to be confronted by or faced with? Why are we becoming less good at resilience?
I think you nailed it, in the sense that it's easier to avoid those situations now than ever. It's easier to kind of say, okay, never mind, I'm not going to go down that path or deal with that thing. I'm just going to avoid it. And we can see it especially in the US. There's often this culture of what I call safetyism, which is, you know, don't let your kids go out and play. Like, be the overprotective parent who doesn't let them rough and tumble on the playground and stuff like that. And again, the psychological research is pretty clear, is if you protect too much, you never grow, because like that, you need that stressor, that thing that creates a little bit of fear, to be able to push you to understand how to deal with it.
And I guess also, just thinking about this theme a little bit further, the pressure on people these days, you put so much pressure on yourself to sort of excel and be great at every single thing you turn your hand to. And the expectation that you place on yourself, as well as society places on you to be that person too. Are we just signing ourselves up for just way too much here? Are we just trying to be too good at everything and take on everything, and be, that person that can have it all of the time?
That's the essence and the argument I make in my newest book, Win the Inside Game, which is simple. We evolved or grew up to live in a local world, and we got thrust into this global world where expectations are just outlandish. And I'll use the example you gave me. You ran the 1500 in 6:30, which in the grand scheme of things is
It's
pretty
brilliant.
dang good. Yeah, it is. But nowadays, nowadays, if you ran that, you might hop online or on social media or at the list, and you might like, oh, I'm not very good. Like, this sucks. I'm going to quit this thing because there's so many people faster than me. And that's what happens to all of us because our comparison point is no longer like, hey, am I the fastest in the neighborhood or am I the best at math or science in my, class of 20 people? It's literally the freaking world. And when that's the comparison point, guess what? It pushes us down and we lose that motivation and we never explore the things that might turn into our passions.
I want to talk to you about this, like this three-part framework that you've got going on in your book, Win the Inside Game. So be, do, and belong. Can we take each of them individually? So under the B category, be a clarity on who you are. What do you mean by that?
So coming back to that failure piece or handling the struggle, what research consistently tells us, and then my work with elite performers is that if you have security in your sense of self, you are going to be more resilient.
So
Why?
self-esteem and self-confidence and
Right. And all of that stuff, that self-confidence. And I think where we get it wrong sometimes is we think that we almost have to like fake our way through it. But the way I like to explain it is like confidence demands evidence. So the best thing that you can do is do difficult things or challenging things so that you can give yourself the evidence that, hey, I've shown up to this. I've challenged myself in this way. And that gives you that security in your sense of self so that you can handle the difficult moments in life.
so you've got to just be braver, basically. Just have the balls to go out there and take it on, whether you succeed or fail. At least you've experienced it, and you've got that experience in your repertoire. The do category, which is part of this three-part framework, is the clarity in your pursuits. Again, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, what I mean by that is so often nowadays, what happens is we pursue things almost because other people tell us to, or that it's like what society tells us to go for. And what, again, research and working with elite performers tells us is that it's got to come from within. So, if your motivation to pursue a job or a sport is more external, extrinsic, meaning the accolades, you want the money, you want the followers, you want the achievements. That works good temporarily, but over the long haul, it backfires. The best performers, overwhelmingly across business to sport, have more intrinsic motivation, meaning they pursue the thing because, yeah, the achievements are good, they're great, we all want them. We're not saying that, but there's some sort of joy, curiosity, like exploration of like, let's see what my potential is that fuels the task underneath. And that fuel lasts much longer than the extrinsic side.
It's funny, isn't it? I was thinking to myself the other day, actually, I found myself at a dinner and I was just chatting to someone next to me about this. It, being happy is part of this successful piece, isn't it? Because you can succeed in a way that you're fulfilled financially and in other ways, and materialistically, but to actually succeed in being happy is a little bit tougher. And I guess finding that balance for people who are really successful is really hard because they're ever so focused on the stuff that's about achievement rather necessarily about the stuff that's about fulfillment. When you're dealing with CEOs and extraordinary sports characters who are driven to the nth degree, like my husband, how do you manage that? How do you sort of rebalance people that are of that mindset?
Yeah, a lot of it is at that level is those people are strivers and pushers. So the striving for the achievement or the success comes naturally. And what you're trying to do is not get rid of that. You're trying to harness that, but get them a tad to be able to what I call it, let go or create some constraints around their work so that they can flourish in other avenues
But
and get
will they lose their edge if they do that? Will they lose that, like, that bit which is the bit that makes them so different from everybody else?
That's the fear that everyone has, and I'm gonna say it point blank. That's insecurity. It's not true. And the example I'll give is one of the clearest, and in my sport. But for a long time, I worked with a world class runner named Sarah Hall, who was very good, but didn't quite reach the world class level until she was in her late 30s. I think at 38, she placed second at the London Marathon. So phenomenal. In talking with her, you ask how she did that, and she says, "I finally let go of my relentless drive for the success because like focusing on the achievements was stealing my joy and stealing my peace." And once I realized, yeah, I want to win, but it's more, hey, I get this opportunity to line up in the biggest race in the world and see what I am capable of. Like she finally was able to kind of free herself up from that
But
baggage.
do you think she was only able to do that because she was of that age where she felt, well, I'm gonna not have too much longer left of doing what I'm doing here. If I don't get to that mental mindset now, I'm never gonna get there and I won't know what's possible. And doing it the other way hasn't got me to where I wanted to necessarily be.
I think we need wisdom, and no matter what coaching or advice comes, especially when you're young, sometimes we got to figure it out on our journey. And I think you're right. I think with age comes wisdom. And my goal is to say, hey, maybe we can learn this a couple years earlier or plant that seed, but you have to get in the arena and do the thing and experiment and see. Um, but it's true. Another example I'll give on this is Tony Hawk, the world class
Oh,
skateboarder.
he's awesome. Yeah.
Awesome, right? So in the documentary movie on his life, there was this wonderful line where he was again at the top of the world, but he was struggling. He was like, what should I do? What can I do next?" He was trying to do his famous 900 trick, but he was falling short. And his good friend and fellow skateboarder told him, I'll quote, "Risk not winning."
Yes.
And that was the thing. After he did that, he said, "Okay, I'll try this." He hit his 900 trick and, again, succeeded at the highest level. He was older as well. So sometimes maybe we need to go through that journey to get that wisdom. But the point is that if you're listening to this and you're a CEO or a high performer and you're like, "I can't, that'll take my edge off." That's mostly insecurity. I'm not asking you to not care about winning. Just try a little bit, just to step back and emphasize that joy, exploration, happiness, just a tad, and you might surprise yourself.
I think that's true of a lot of high performers. I think there's that insecurity as part of the drive as well to prove others wrong, as well as themselves in that category. So I think that is part of their edge, but also, like you say, it can also be the flaw that can cause problems. And I guess also with that bit you were saying about Tony Hawk and risking it all and everything else. I guess that's also the way that we get talked about. If you're going into a contract negotiation, walk into the contract negotiation as if you're prepared to walk straight out with nothing, because the confidence that will belie and give to the opposition or whoever you're negotiating with, it's very clear then, isn't it, that you're prepared to walk away. So you're suddenly a more attractive proposition. I mean, it sort of feeds its way through and permeates its way, this way of thinking, through all walks of life, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a brilliant example. I think you're
You
spot
can
on.
have it. You can have
Yeah.
my example and put it in your next
I
book.
There we go. I'll credit you. Don't worry. I'll borrow that one from you.
I know, it's a wonderful one. The rest of the three-part framework concludes with belonging and how you fit in. So why is this important?
I think this is probably the most important. And it's often neglected in our modern world because I think a lot of times now we almost have this epidemic of loneliness if you look at the data. And it's because we've kind of transferred from, again, local to global society. So we have a lot of superficial connections or superficial friends, but we don't have that deep sense of genuine connection and belonging a lot of times. And why that is important is pretty clear. Is that if you look at the psychology, we developed to share the load. So literally, if we have friends or family nearby or supporting us, it changes our perception of the difficulty of the task. I'll give you a couple of research examples. One of my favorites is they take partners, so people in a relationship, and they take one of them, stick them in an fMRI machine so they can scan their brain, and then they do something to create like fear or pain. So
Oh,
they'll
no.
they'll put like a snake near their head
Oh, my
or a
God.
hot electric probe on their arm to create pain. And they'll do that same thing with people who are either alone or who are simply holding the hand of their partner. And whenever you're holding your hand of your
Yeah.
partner, the fear and pain centers in your brain go up about half as much. So
Wow.
again, like when we have friends nearby, it shifts us. The same thing
Well, I'm
they've
like
got.
that on a plane. If I'm traveling on a plane and the turbulence starts to occur, the other day we were on a flight somewhere and the pilot came over and we were about 3 hours from our destination, which is that horrible moment where you know you're literally over the ocean. And he said, "Oh, we are going to be encountering severe turbulence." It wasn't just turbulence; it was severe turbulence. Like, oh crap, this is going to be awful. And I did exactly that. I reached out for my husband. My kids are both asleep, so that's perfect. But I reached out for my husband's hand and it does naturally, I feel so much calmer because I've got him around me and I know that, it feels like a safer environment to be in. So I can completely and utterly relate to that in, just that small way. 100% I can see that. But it's weird because CEOs, sports stars, especially not necessarily of teams, but maybe individual sports, but they lead quite lonely existences. They can often be, you think about a swimmer who is just forever singularly in their thoughts, lap after lap after length after, just constantly trying to build what they need to do to be better and better. Alone in your thoughts, it's a singular focus. It's a very lonely existence. A CEO of a business is often a lonely person, aren't they? And that all the decisions and the responsibilities ultimately lie with them. So how do you overcome that with this framework?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think that's why it's even more important because if you look at the ones who have achieved over the long haul sustainably, they often have created their own, support network,
Mm.
whether that's coaches, sports
Yeah.
psychologists, loved ones, family, etc. That allows them to do that because in the lonely existence of staring at a line and going back and forth and just being in your own head, if you don't have that support group, that's a lot to weigh on your shoulders. The same with the CEO, and it can get overwhelming very quickly. So I think, yes, it's going to be a more lonely existence, but I think that's even more important why in the background, maybe you have this support network or that sounding board that allows you to, have this other people in your life that allows you to share some of that load instead of take on the full burden of it.
Yeah, and it's 10 times more fun doing it with people around you that you love and admire and respect and everything else. Can we talk about sleep? It's something that's very close to my heart because we fundamentally are building a business on the basis of good sleep. And actually, what we've learned through Ben and the team and the work we've done to develop night powder and day powder subsequently, the circadian rhythm, sleep, recovery from injury, inflammation, good stress sometimes can be a good thing depending on, what's happening where in your body. Can we just talk about the power of sleep as a recovery mechanism?
Yeah, I think it's the best recovery tool there is. And the science backs that up because if you
Yeah.
look at sleep, it's when most of the recovery hormones that move our body from like a breakdown state to a buildup state occur. So if you look at overnight, you go to sleep, what happens? It's when we get our biggest hit of testosterone. It's when we get our largest hit of human growth hormone, all things that athletes might cheat with to perform better, but we get our natural hit of
It's a
those
natural
things,
performance
or it's
enhancer, is what you're saying.
bingo. So, and the research backs this up. If you don't get much sleep, your testosterone levels just plummet. So, what I tell athletes and performers all the time is like, why would you not want to get that recovery boost? So, optimizing sleep and taking care of that is, again, the simplest and most effective way to boost our recovery.
And Steve, I get that with athletes because they have an understanding that fundamentally good sleep is a performance tool. How do you try and convince a CEO of the same thing? Because most often in their world, they're like up at 5 a.m. 8 hours sleep for them is just absolutely not viable, let alone something that they want to brag about because mainly they're talking about how they got absolutely no sleep and how cool is that because I was busy working all the time. So it's sort of not necessarily a fashion. Is it becoming more fashionable to sleep more and better and get better quality sleep amongst the CEO brigade as it has been for a while with athletes?
I think they're starting to understand that. And I think it's easy to understand it from the physical side, but we're starting to get the realization from the mental or cognitive. And the way I try and convince them is this is if you look at when you learn, so when you take in that information that you've been studying and debating and going back and forth on all day, it's during sleep. Literally during sleep, our brain kind of says, okay, let's sort through this mess and determine what do we want to make sense of and what do we want to store over the long haul and what don't we? If we don't get enough sleep, that process is reduced and harmed. So we don't retain the stuff that we're coming in. And then on the flip side, when we look at cognitive performance, so our ability to stay focused, our ability to do that deliberate work that we know we have to as a leader of a company and stay sharp, if we start to get less than 6 hours or so sleep, what happens is we see the drain. You can look at a variety of psychological studies where they put people through demanding mental tasks, and when we don't get sleep, our performance drops. So why in the world, when you want to be sharp in that negotiation or that meeting or that tactics thing that you have to do, why would you go in, not 100% cognitively?
Yeah, and we know it's great mentally for, rebuilding all of those pathways so that the next morning you wake up sharper, more focused, more cognitively able, all of those things. But physically, you think about an athlete, it's important for an athlete, but we talk a lot about the everyday person. So somebody who's striving for better performance, but isn't necessarily an athlete, but may like doing triathlons or might be into performance at a really decent level. How important is it from a recovery from a physical perspective in terms of your inflammation and your cellular recovery and repair?
Yeah, it's huge. And I think it's almost, I would argue it's almost more important for those people because think about it, is they're striving athletically, but most likely they have a full-time job
Yeah, they're
and more
doing everything.
commitments. They're doing everything. So if you look at the total life stress load, it's a ton. And they don't have maybe all the fancy recovery things that a elite athlete would. So sleep is the best tool to do that. And if we look at things like stress hormones, like cortisol,
Yeah.
if you don't get your sleep, those are going to be elevated, which means what? You're going to be in a breakdown and stress, state instead of the good stress and repair state. Same if we look at inflammatory markers, right? In the muscle themselves, is if we don't get that sleep, inflammation's going to be up. What does that mean? We're not going to be able to, work and recover and do the things that we need to. And if you look at overall health, that inflammatory markers are going to kind of lead to poor overall general health. So if you look at all those things, especially if you're training at any level and you're have a full-time job, you got to prioritize the sleep.
Yeah, you say that sleep is the fundamental performance um uh just fundamental to performance as a CEO, as a sports person, as an everyday person. For you, how important is it in that arena?
I think it's number one. I mean, I think too often what happens is we reach for the fancy gadgets or the quick fixes instead of saying, how do we make sure, and I get it, it's tough, but how do we make sure that we can get enough sleep and do the things necessarily to help our body, get the deep sleep and long sleep that we need?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think what's really interesting when we developed our powders, we were very much focused on the circadian rhythm piece as well,
Yep.
because what your body needs when it needs it is completely different depending on, where you're at in the time of the day. And I think too often you sort of accept a one size fits all, and you can be given something that, is just take this once a day or take this whenever you feel a bit low or whatever that is. But the consistency, as athletes would know, fundamentally the consistency and the regularity and the accumulative gain of doing something with a repetitive nature, you can actually then really look to that and sort of see where your gains are coming from. And you know yourself so much better for that. So the buildup of a routine is all part of this as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, again, the research and the data, it shows that the routine is probably, again, what impacts things the most is if you can stick to that routine and get it, you're going to be in a better situation. And in fact, there was a study that compared if your sleep was in a regular routine and you still only got, let's say 7 hours, that was much better than being out of routine and sometimes getting 8 hours and sometimes getting 5 hours and sometimes going to bed at midnight and sometimes going to bed at 10 o'clock and sometimes 2 a.m. It's that routine that kind of locks our body in, just like an elite athlete would, where for our brain and our body, it becomes predictable. And then once it becomes predictable for us, what happens is our body kind of fine tunes when we release those hormones and all that good stuff so that like it optimizes, how we're going to recover, repair, and perform.
I'm going to ask you a final question to sort of sum up everything. How much happier are you as a person for knowing all this stuff now, as opposed to that man, that 18-year-old that ran the mile effectively in just a smidgen over 4 minutes?
I'm a lot happier and more balanced, I would say, because I realize, if you look back then, I thought, hey, if I just work harder all the time, I'm gonna get better. In that story, we absolutely need hard work. Absolutely. But if we don't balance it out with this recovery piece, if we don't prioritize sleep, if we don't look at our overall life and say, hey, there has to be some sort of downtime or other outlets, occasionally, um, it's a lot more fun to do it that way than just kind of, be the monk and just be like, I'm going to beat my head against the wall until I break. And more often than not, you're going to break if you don't do these other things.
Yeah, I think you're so right. It's about some perspective and some balance and trying to do as best a job you can, but not being afraid of failure and absolutely wholeheartedly having a lot of laughs along the way, for sure. Steve, thanks so much. It's been brilliant chatting to you. Thanks so much because I know you're miles away in Texas, but sending you lots of love from over this side of the pond.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons, and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point, I just kind of just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.